A warrior stood at a crossroads with two paths before him. The first path led back to his village, warm fires, familiar faces, comfortable conversations, and everyone who knew him and accepted him as he was. The second path led into the mountains, cold nights, dangerous terrain, complete solitude, and years of painful self-discovery with no guarantee of return. He chose the mountain path and walked alone for 30 years. Most people would call this insanity, abandoning connection for isolation, trading warmth for suffering, choosing loneliness over belonging. But this warrior understood something that modern society refuses to teach. Becoming your true self is impossible while surrounded by people who need you to remain your old self. There is a psychological transformation protocol that Japanese masters discovered in the 1600s, one that neuroscience only validated in 2019. They called it Dokodo, the way of walking alone. Western researchers call it identity reformation through social detachment, and they have proven it is the only method that creates authentic self-transformation. But there is a brutal truth: everything about human nature and modern culture conspires to prevent you from walking this path. You know that feeling when you try to change and everyone around you, family, friends, society, subtly pulls you back to who you used to be. That is not a coincidence. That is the system working exactly as designed. And until you understand why walking alone is necessary, you will never become who you are meant to be. Today, you will discover why Miyamoto Musashi chose decades of solitude over a lifetime of comfort, why he deliberately severed every relationship that kept him small, and why the path to your true self has always required walking away from everyone who loves your false self. But here is the warning: this path will cost you everything familiar, and most people would rather live as a comfortable lie than suffer as an emerging truth. Before I show you why walking alone is the only way to become real, tell me in the comments what version of yourself you are pretending to be to keep others comfortable. Now, let's begin with the moment Musashi realized that his biggest enemy wasn't any opponent. It was his own need for approval. Chapter 1: The Death of the Old Self. Musashi sat in a tavern at age 23, surrounded by admirers. He had just won his 15th duel and was being celebrated as the rising star of swordsmanship. Drinks were flowing, stories were being told about his victories, and everyone wanted to be near the famous warrior. He should have felt victorious. Instead, he felt hollow. That night, alone in his room, he wrote in his diary, "They celebrate the swordsman they think I am. But I am not the swordsman they think I am. I am not even the swordsman I think I am. I don't know who I am when no one is watching, and this terrifies me more than any blade." He realized something devastating. He had become addicted to their version of him. Every time someone praised his technique, he felt a surge of validation. Every time someone told stories of his duels, he felt important. Every time someone introduced him as the great swordsman, his identity felt solid. He had become dependent on their reflection to know who he was. But that reflection was a lie. They saw the victories, not the fear before each duel. They saw the confidence, not the doubt that consumed him. They saw the skill, not the desperate practice to maintain an image. They loved a performance, not a person. And he had become so skilled at the performance that he had forgotten there was supposed to be a person underneath. This is the first death required for authentic transformation, the death of your performed self. You know exactly what this feels like. The version of yourself you present to your family, agreeable, predictable, playing the role they assigned you decades ago. The version you show your friends, fun, uncomplicated, never changing too much because it makes them uncomfortable. The version at work, competent, fitting in, not too ambitious because it threatens the balance. These aren't conscious lies. They are survival adaptations. You learned early that certain versions of you get approval, and other versions get rejection. So you emphasized the approved parts and buried the rest. After years, the performance became automatic. You stopped noticing you were performing. But here's what Musashi discovered that night in the tavern: every performance requires an audience, and audiences have a vested interest in keeping you performing. They don't want you to change because your change disrupts their comfort. They love your role in their story. They hate when characters evolve because it forces them to question their own stagnation. Research from Stanford University on identity and social feedback shows this pattern clearly. People receive 6 to 8 times more positive reinforcement for behaving consistently with others' expectations than for authentic behavior that challenges those expectations. Your social environment is literally designed to keep you playing your assigned role. This is why changing yourself while staying in the same social environment is nearly impossible. Not because you lack willpower, but because every person around you is unconsciously invested in your staying the same. They'll tell you they want you to grow. They'll say they support your transformation. But watch their reactions when you actually start changing, the subtle disapproval, the jokes about you going through a phase, the concern that you're becoming someone different. They want you to improve within acceptable boundaries, never to fundamentally transform. Musashi sat in that tavern and realized, as long as these people are watching, I will perform for them. As long as I'm performing for them, I will never discover who I actually am. To find my true self, I must kill the performed self. And to kill the performed self, I must remove the audience. But killing your performed self isn't just about removing external audiences. There's an internal audience that's even more dangerous. And Musashi was about to discover that walking alone meant something far more terrifying than just physical solitude. Chapter 2: The Way of Walking Alone. 3 months after leaving the tavern, Musashi faced his first night completely alone in the mountains. No admirers, no stories being told about him, no identity reflected back through others' eyes. Just him, a fire, and absolute silence. The panic was immediate. Who am I when no one is watching? Am I still a great swordsman if no one calls me great? Do I still exist if no one confirms my existence? His mind generated desperate fantasies, returning to the village, creating reasons why he needed to check on friends, inventing emergencies that required his presence. Anything to escape the terrifying emptiness of not knowing who he was without external validation. This was his introduction to Dokodo, the way of walking alone, not just physical isolation, but the deliberate removal of all external sources of identity confirmation. He thought the hard part would be leaving people behind. He discovered the hard part was facing who he was when the audience disappeared. Week 1, his mind obsessed over memories of praise. Every compliment he had ever received, every victory that had defined him. He clung to these memories like a drowning man clings to debris. They were all he had left of his identity. Week 2, the memories started feeling hollow. They belonged to interactions with people who weren't there, victories that felt meaningful only because others had witnessed them, praise from people whose opinions suddenly seemed irrelevant. His entire sense of self was built on external validation that no longer existed. Week 3, complete identity collapse. He couldn't remember who he had been before people started telling him who he was. He couldn't access any sense of authentic preference or desire that wasn't shaped by others' expectations. He felt like an empty shell that had only existed as a reflection in others' eyes. This is the most dangerous phase of walking alone. Most people turn back here because facing your own emptiness feels like death. And in a way, it is. It's the death of who you thought you were, the death of your socially constructed identity, the death of every version of yourself that existed only to gain approval. Modern psychology has a term for this: identity foreclosure dissolution. When the external structures that defined your identity are removed, the identity collapses into what researchers call an authentic selfhood crisis. It feels like dying because the performed self is dying. But that death is necessary for authentic birth. Week 4, Musashi stopped trying to remember who he had been and started noticing who he was. Without anyone to impress, what did he actually enjoy doing? Without anyone to judge him, what thoughts naturally arose? Without anyone to perform for, what felt genuinely important? The answers surprised him. He liked long periods of silence, something he'd never noticed because he'd been constantly surrounded by conversation. He was drawn to philosophical questions about life and death, interests he'd suppressed because warriors weren't supposed to be philosophical. He felt genuine compassion for struggling people, an emotion he'd hidden because it seemed weak. These weren't earth-shattering revelations. They were quiet discoveries of who he'd always been underneath the performance. But accessing them had required removing everyone who had a vested interest in his staying the same. Month 3, he understood why this path was called the way of walking alone. It wasn't just that you had to walk away from people. If you want, I can continue by cleaning the rest in the exact same style. It was that you had to walk away from every version of yourself that people had created, and then walk into the terrifying unknown of who you might actually be. But understanding the necessity of walking alone wasn't enough, because there's a second death required for authentic transformation, one that's even more painful than losing external validation. It's the death of your internal comfort addiction. And this death requires something most people will never volunteer for. Chapter 3, The Forging of the Sword. 6 months into his solitude, Musashi faced a new enemy, his own desperate need for comfort. Alone in the mountains, every instinct screamed for ease. Sleep longer. Eat whatever was available. Skip training when it was cold. Rest when it was difficult. Avoid anything that caused discomfort. His body and mind had become addicted to the path of least resistance. He realized this was the second prison he needed to escape, the addiction to comfort that keeps you weak. Musashi wrote, "A sword begins as crude iron, soft, shapeless, useless for battle. To become a blade that can cut through anything, it must be heated until it glows, hammered until it screams, cooled in water so cold it shocks every fiber. The iron fights every stage of this process because transformation is agony. But without this agony, it remains worthless iron forever." He understood he was the crude iron. Solitude had removed the external pressures that had kept him performing. Now he needed internal pressure to forge himself into something real. This began the most brutal phase of his journey, deliberately choosing pain as a tool for transformation. Every morning, cold water on his face regardless of weather. Every day, training until exhaustion regardless of motivation. Every evening, reflection on his weaknesses regardless of how it felt. No exceptions, no negotiations with comfort, no mercy for the part of him that wanted to quit. Why this extreme approach? Because Musashi had discovered something that modern self-help culture refuses to acknowledge: your true self isn't hiding under comfort. It's forged through voluntary suffering. Think about who you become when life is easy, when everything goes according to plan, when you don't face challenges. You become soft, reactive, dependent on circumstances for your state of mind. The comfortable version of yourself isn't your true self. It's your weakest self. Your true self emerges only under pressure, when you're forced to choose between what's easy and what's right, when comfort isn't available and you must find strength you didn't know you had, when external support disappears and you must rely on internal resources. But here's the critical insight: you can't wait for life to provide this pressure, because when it comes involuntarily, you're not prepared for it. You must create voluntary pressure. Choose difficulty before difficulty chooses you. Research from Yale University on post-traumatic growth shows this principle clearly. Individuals who voluntarily expose themselves to manageable stress develop psychological resilience that transfers to all areas of life. But the key word is voluntary. Chosen difficulty builds strength. Imposed difficulty often breaks people who haven't prepared. Musashi's daily practice became a forge for his character. Cold water taught him that discomfort was temporary and survivable. Exhausting training taught him that he was capable of far more than he thought. Honest self-reflection taught him that facing truth was always better than avoiding it. Month by month, something was changing, not just his skills, but his fundamental relationship with difficulty. Pain stopped being something to avoid and became information about what needed attention. Discomfort stopped being an enemy and became a teacher, showing him where growth was possible. But the most profound change was this: he stopped needing comfort to feel strong. Strength came from within, generated through the daily choice to do what was difficult rather than what was easy. This internal strength was unshakable because it didn't depend on external circumstances. By year 1, he realized he'd become a different person entirely, not because he'd added something new, but because he'd removed everything false and strengthened everything real. The performance was dead. The comfort addiction was dead. What remained was simply who he'd always been underneath, but now forged into something unbreakable. But there was one final test waiting. because walking alone and forging yourself through difficulty only prepares you for the ultimate challenge, returning to the world as your authentic self and facing the reactions of people who preferred your performed self. Chapter 4: The Return of the True Self. After 2 years of complete solitude, Musashi made a decision that would test everything he'd learned. He would return to the world, not to resume his old life. That person was dead. He would return to see if his true self could survive in society. The first test came immediately. He entered a village where people recognized him from his previous reputation. They expected the old Musashi, the performer, the people-pleaser, the one who needed their approval. Instead, they met someone completely different. He didn't perform his victories, didn't seek validation, didn't adjust his behavior based on their reactions. When they told familiar stories about his past, he listened politely but didn't participate. When they expected certain responses, he gave honest ones instead. The confusion was immediate. "You've changed," they said, not as a compliment, but as an accusation. This is the moment that destroys most people's transformation, because you discover that people don't actually want you to change. They want you to improve within the boundaries of their comfort zone. They want you to become a better version of who they think you are, not to become someone entirely different. When you return to the world as your authentic self, you threaten everyone who's still living as their performed self. Your authenticity becomes a mirror that shows them their own inauthenticity. Your strength highlights their weakness. Your refusal to seek validation exposes their addiction to it. This creates 2 types of reactions, both painful in different ways. The first reaction is rejection. People who used to welcome you now find you uncomfortable to be around, not because you're hostile or difficult, but because you're no longer predictable. They don't know how to relate to someone who isn't performing for their approval. You disturb their social ecosystem because you're no longer playing your assigned role. Musashi experienced this everywhere he went. Old friends suddenly had little to say to him. Fellow warriors felt judged by his presence, even though he wasn't judging them. People preferred the memory of who he used to be to the reality of who he'd become. The second reaction is testing. People who sense your transformation will unconsciously test it. They'll try to provoke the old reactions, attempt to pull you back into old patterns, use guilt, manipulation, or social pressure to see if you'll revert to your performed self. Musashi faced this constantly, challenges to prove he was still the same person, accusations that he thought he was better than everyone, attempts to make him feel guilty for changing. Each test was an invitation to abandon his authentic self and return to the comfortable lie of performance. But here's what he discovered: every test passed made him stronger. Every attempt to pull him back to his false self proved that his true self was real. Every rejection by people who preferred his performance confirmed that his transformation was genuine. The loneliness was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't the desperate loneliness of someone who needed external validation to exist. It was the clean loneliness of someone who knew exactly who he was and was willing to be that person regardless of social approval. Research from Harvard Business School on authentic leadership shows this pattern consistently. Individuals who undergo authentic transformation face an average 2-year period of social disruption where previous relationships either evolve or end. But those who maintain their authentic self during this period report significantly higher life satisfaction and more meaningful relationships long-term. The key insight: relationships built on your performed self cannot survive your authentic transformation. And that's not a problem to solve. It's a feature, not a bug. Relationships that require you to pretend aren't worth maintaining. But some relationships do survive. The rare people who value growth over comfort, who prefer authenticity to performance, who support your becoming rather than demanding you remain. These relationships become deeper than anything you experienced while performing. 3 years after his return, Musashi had built an entirely new life around his authentic self. Fewer relationships, but infinitely more meaningful ones. Less social approval, but complete self-approval. More solitude, but zero loneliness, because he genuinely enjoyed his own company. He discovered the ultimate paradox of walking alone: you must leave everyone who needs you to stay the same in order to find the few people who love you for who you're becoming. Chapter 5: The Complete Path. At age 60, Musashi wrote the Judo 21 principles for those who choose to walk alone. But the deeper teaching wasn't in the principles themselves. It was in understanding why this path, though painful, was the only path to authentic transformation. He summarized the complete journey in 4 stages. Stage 1, the death of the performed self. You must kill every version of yourself that exists only to gain approval. This means removing yourself from environments and relationships that reward performance over authenticity. Most people never complete this stage because the death feels too real. Stage 2, the forge of voluntary suffering. You must replace comfort addiction with strength cultivation. Choose difficulty daily. Make discomfort your teacher. Build internal resilience that doesn't depend on external circumstances. Most people who survive stage 1 quit here because voluntary suffering goes against every instinct. Stage 3, the discovery of authentic self. In the space between the death of performance and the birth of strength, you discover who you actually are, not who others want you to be, not who you think you should be, but who you actually are when no one is watching and nothing is comfortable. Stage 4, the return as truth. You bring your authentic self back to the world, knowing that many will reject it and few will understand it. But you no longer need their understanding to know who you are. Your identity comes from within, not from external reflection. This is why walking alone is necessary. Not because solitude is inherently good, but because authentic transformation is impossible while surrounded by people invested in your staying the same. The path costs everything familiar. Your performed identity dies. Your comfort addiction dies. Many of your relationships die. Parts of your old life die. You walk through a valley of deaths to be reborn as who you were always meant to be. But what you gain is worth everything you lose: unshakable self-knowledge, internal strength that doesn't depend on circumstances, relationships based on truth rather than performance, the ability to be alone without being lonely because you genuinely enjoy who you are. Most importantly, you gain something no external force can take away: the knowledge that you are real, not a performance, not a reflection, not an adaptation to others' expectations. Real. This is what Musashi meant by walking alone. Not permanent isolation, but the willingness to be alone rather than be false. The courage to face who you are when the audience disappears. The strength to choose growth over comfort even when growth is painful. That warrior at the crossroads, choosing the mountain path over the village path. 30 years of solitude. 30 years of voluntary difficulty. 30 years of discovering who he was when no one was watching. He didn't emerge from the mountains as the same person who entered. The performed self had died. The comfort addiction had died. The need for external validation had died. What emerged was simply who he'd always been, but forged into something unbreakable. Your crossroads is waiting. The comfortable path back to familiar relationships, familiar performances, familiar lies. The difficult path into the unknown of who you might actually be. Most choose comfort. Most live their entire lives as performances for audiences who will forget them the moment they die. Most never discover their authentic self because they are never willing to walk away from their performed self. But you have another choice. Kill the performance. Choose voluntary difficulty. Walk alone until you discover who you are. Return to the world as truth rather than fiction. The path will cost you everything familiar. But what you'll find in exchange is yourself. What version of yourself are you performing to keep others comfortable? What would die if you stopped performing? Write it honestly. That's the first step on the path. Remember Musashi's final teaching: you must walk alone, not because you hate people, but because you love truth. And truth cannot emerge while you're performing for approval. Stop performing. Start walking. Walk alone. The true self is waiting.